The chandeliers blazed like miniature suns above the grand ballroom, scattering shards of gold across marble floors polished so smooth they reflected the guests' jeweled shoes. Waiters glided between tables with trays of champagne, the bubbles rising in tall crystal flutes like tiny stars ascending to heaven. Laughter and conversation swirled in the air, mingling with the faint perfume of lilies arranged in silver vases that dotted the room. At the far end, like a monarch upon a throne, sat Lawrence Kensington III, billionaire magnate, heir to an empire of shipping and steel, and self-styled patron of the arts. Lawrence was not a man known for humility. Everything about him radiated power and possession, the cut of his midnight suit, the diamond at his cuff, even the way he leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, surveying his guests as though the world itself had been laid out for his inspection. Tonight, the celebration was not for a birthday, nor an anniversary, nor even for business. It was simply a night for him to remind the city that his wealth was inexhaustible and his influence unmatched. And as with all of his gatherings, at the center of the spectacle sat the object he most loved to flaunt, his grand piano. It was no ordinary instrument. Imported from Vienna, custom-built by one of the last master craftsmen, it gleamed like a jewel under the chandeliers. Its polished ebony surface mirrored the faces of those who dared approach it, while inside, its strings sang with the promise of symphonies. Lawrence often boasted that even the great Rachmaninoff would have envied its resonance. The piano was not merely an instrument, it was a symbol of prestige, a silent proclamation of wealth. As the evening wore on, a group of Lawrence's closest associates gathered near the piano, their laughter rising above the chatter of the ballroom. Glasses clinked. Ties were loosened. Lawrence, fueled by his own self-importance and perhaps too much brandy, gestured toward the piano with a flourish. "Behold," he declared, his voice booming enough to draw the attention of the nearest dozen guests, "the finest piano on this side of the Atlantic. She has been touched only by masters, and only when I've permitted it." He paused, savoring the hush that followed, then added with a sly grin, "But let us make the night interesting." The crowd leaned in. Lawrence thrived on these moments, the ones where he could transform a gathering into a stage for his arrogance. "I propose a challenge," he said, rising to his feet. "If anyone here, anyone at all, can sit at this piano and play with the brilliance of a virtuoso, I shall do something outrageous. I shall marry them on the spot." A ripple of laughter spread through the hall, nervous at first, then swelling as more guests caught the humor. Someone clapped, another whistled. The notion was absurd, but absurdity was the lifeblood of the wealthy. It entertained them, gave them stories to share at other glittering gatherings. Lawrence basked in the laughter, his smirk widening. "Yes, you heard me," he pressed on. "If a man can play, he wins my fortune as a brother-in-law. If a woman can play, she shall become Mrs. Kensington herself. A fair bargain, is it not?" The guests roared. The women feigned swoons, the men raised their glasses in mock salute. It was a spectacle now, a theater of mockery dressed up as a game. One young woman, her pearls trembling as she giggled, teased, "And what if none of us can play, Lawrence?" Then, Lawrence said with a shrug, "It proves what I already know, that true genius belongs to the few, to me and to those I choose to honor." The laughter grew sharper, tinged with cruelty. Eyes darted around the room, searching for some unsuspecting fool to push toward the piano. Fingers pointed at one another in jest. Yet no one dared sit at the instrument. To play would risk humiliation. Better to laugh and remain safe than to expose oneself to Lawrence's ridicule. Through it all, silent and unseen, moved Samuel. Samuel was the janitor of Kensington Hall. His uniform was plain, his shoes worn from countless hours polishing the very marble that glittered now beneath the guests' feet. He carried a mop and a bucket, tools that to the guests made him invisible. To them, he was not part of the evening, not even part of the scenery, merely a shadow in the periphery, a servant to keep their reflections flawless. Yet Samuel's eyes, deep and steady, lingered on the piano. He had seen it many times, of course, while scrubbing the floors or dusting the chandeliers. But tonight, with Lawrence's cruel challenge ringing in the air, the instrument seemed to call to him, its black and white keys like a secret alphabet he alone could read. His hands, though calloused from labor, twitched with the memory of long-forgotten notes. Lawrence, meanwhile, reveled in his mockery. He strutted toward the piano, running his hand over its polished lid. "It is a pity, truly," he said, "that genius is so rare. Music is the language of gods, but few among us can speak it." He plinked a few notes clumsily, then laughed at himself. The crowd laughed with him, not because the notes were pleasant, but because Lawrence's wealth made even his failings a form of entertainment. In the shadows, Samuel's jaw tightened. He had once known the language of gods. Long before life had worn him down, before tragedy had driven him into anonymity, music had been his world. The piano was not merely wood and strings, it was memory, it was hope, it was the voice he had buried. As the billionaire continued to bask in the echo of his own arrogance, Samuel moved quietly around the edge of the room, unnoticed. He dipped his mop in the bucket, wrung it out, and pressed it against the marble. The rhythm of his movements fell in time with the echoing laughter, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on chords, on melodies, on the fire that still lived in his fingers. The challenge, ridiculous as it was, hung in the air like a taunt. To the guests, it was just another game. To Lawrence, it was another chance to flaunt his superiority. But to Samuel, it awakened something long dormant. His gaze flicked once more toward the piano, then quickly away. He could not. He must not. Yet the idea clung to him like a haunting refrain. At that moment, Lawrence raised his glass high. "To genius," he proclaimed. "May it never be found among the unworthy." The guests roared in agreement, their glasses clashing together. And in the far corner, Samuel dipped his mop once more, the water rippling like a quiet response. The night carried on with its glitter and cruelty, but beneath it all, a storm had begun to gather, one that would shake the arrogance of the billionaire's words, and prove that sometimes genius wears overalls. The ballroom had returned to its rhythm of chatter and champagne, but the billionaire's words hung like smoke in the air. Guests circled in clusters, their eyes glinting with amusement, their voices sharpened by gossip. Laughter rippled from corner to corner, not with joy but with the cruel delight of people who had found a new target for ridicule. Lawrence Kensington III had given them a spectacle, and now they sharpened it into a weapon. The grand piano, polished and proud, sat untouched at the center of it all. It gleamed under the chandeliers, but instead of reverence, it became the centerpiece of mockery. Like a throne waiting for a fool, it invited whispers and dares. Each guest knew what Lawrence had done. He had turned art into arrogance, music into a stage for humiliation. "Imagine it," one gentleman sneered, swirling his glass of burgundy. "A janitor or some maid plunking out notes. Can you see it? They'd sound like a child with a tin whistle." A woman in a silk gown laughed behind her gloved hand. And Lawrence standing there, pretending to marry them. "I nearly choked on my wine." The circle erupted, the sound of their amusement echoing louder than the quartet still playing discreetly in the corner. The musicians' bows moved dutifully across strings, but even they could sense the cruelty in the air. They played softer, shadows of themselves, as if unwilling to compete with the jeering of the wealthy. Lawrence basked in it all, seated once more at his table, surrounded by admirers. His smirk never left his lips. Each comment, each burst of laughter, was a testament to his power. He had shaped the night. He had declared himself the master of genius, and the crowd followed like moths to flame. Yet among the staff, the atmosphere was different. Waiters exchanged quick glances as they carried trays, eyes down but minds alert. They had heard the billionaire's challenge, and though they smiled politely at guests, they carried unease in their silence. For them, Lawrence's jest was not entertainment, it was a reminder of the wall that divided them from those they served. Samuel worked quietly along the far edge of the room, mop in hand, bucket trailing behind him. He had long learned how to move unnoticed, how to make himself smaller in the presence of the rich. But tonight, every laugh, every sneer, pressed against him like a blade. They mocked not only the idea of someone playing, they mocked the very thought that greatness could exist in anyone outside their gilded circle. He bent low, scrubbing at a corner of the marble floor, but his ears could not close themselves. He heard it all. "You'd think music belonged to them," whispered one of the younger servants to another, passing close to Samuel. Her voice was hushed, but the bitterness was clear. Samuel did not answer. His silence was his shield, but inside, the words struck deep. For him, the piano was no toy, no stage for mockery. He had once lived for it, once believed it could carry him beyond poverty, beyond hardship. But life had turned harsh, and music had slipped from his hands like water through fingers. Now it seemed fate itself had dragged him back into its orbit, not as a player, but as the invisible witness to its humiliation. At the far end of the room, Lawrence rose again. The air shifted as attention snapped back to him. He tapped his glass with a silver fork until the chatter subsided. "My friends," he began, his voice dripping with theatricality, "I see none of you are brave enough to take my little challenge. And that is wise. To sit before this piano is to risk exposing oneself. Better to laugh from the sidelines than to stumble under the spotlight." The guests laughed obediently. "But let us not waste the opportunity," Lawrence continued. "Surely, among our fine company, someone knows enough to amuse us with a tune. Nothing grand, a waltz, perhaps, or a nursery rhyme. I promise I shall not marry you for such small efforts." The crowd howled with laughter again. A few half-hearted volunteers were pushed forward, ladies who had studied piano as girls, men who had dabbled once in college. One after another, they refused, waving their hands with excuses. "I've forgotten everything," one woman protested. "My fingers are stiff from golf," said another. Lawrence chuckled at them all, feeding on their timidity. He leaned against the piano with false affection, stroking its lid as though it were his beloved. "You see, the world is full of pretenders. But true mastery," he paused for effect, scanning the room, "true mastery is a crown only a few may wear." Samuel froze, his mop pressed against the marble. He felt as if Lawrence's words had found him across the crowd. Not directly, not spoken to him, yet sharp enough to pierce through his invisibility. He knew mastery. He had once tasted it. And now it was being paraded as a thing denied to him, mocked as though it could never belong to his kind. The crowd applauded Lawrence's performance as if he had played a symphony himself. He basked in their approval, his arrogance inflating with each cheer. For him, it was not about music. It was about control, control of perception, control of dignity. He had created a stage where only he could stand as the arbiter of greatness. Samuel turned away, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling with quiet restraint. He wanted to vanish into his work, to scrub until his arms ached, to drown the laughter in the rhythm of his mop. But the sound clung to him, the way smoke clings to clothes long after the fire is gone. As the night deepened, Lawrence's challenge became the evening's joke. Guests repeated it in different corners, adding flourishes of mockery. "Play the piano and win a husband," one guest teased, waving her fan. "Play the piano and gain a fortune," another added, spilling champagne with his laughter. The cruelty was never directed at Samuel, not yet. But he felt its weight all the same, pressing closer, circling him like a predator sensing weakness. When the last toast was raised and the final carriage departed, the ballroom fell into silence. The musicians packed their instruments, the servants gathered glasses, and the chandeliers dimmed one by one. The grand piano stood alone, its polished surface catching the dying glow of the lights. Samuel lingered as always, his mop gliding across the marble in slow, deliberate arcs. The echoes of the night's mockery still rang in his ears, but now the room was quiet enough for another sound to rise, the whisper of possibility. His eyes drifted once more to the piano, and for a fleeting moment, the memory of melody stirred inside him, fierce and unyielding. The mockery had been cruel. But it had also lit a spark. When the last of the carriages rolled away and the marble gates of Kensington Hall groaned shut, the mansion exhaled into silence. The echoes of laughter and cruelty lingered faintly in the corridors, like smoke trapped in velvet curtains. The chandeliers had been dimmed to embers, their once glittering brilliance now reduced to tired sparks, while the scent of lilies, bruised from hours of heat and perfume, hung heavy in the still air. Samuel moved slowly through the empty ballroom, mop and bucket rattling softly on the marble. He was the last of the staff to remain, as always. The others had gone to their small quarters at the far end of the estate, their heads heavy with fatigue. Samuel, though tired, never minded these late hours. In the hush after wealth had departed, the house belonged to him. The silence was not oppressive but sacred, a sanctuary carved from the arrogance of the day. Yet tonight, something stirred beneath the silence. The piano. It sat in the center of the room, its lid closed, its keys hidden beneath a polished shell. In the quiet, it seemed almost alive, as though it were breathing softly, waiting. Samuel glanced at it again and again, each time pulling his eyes away, forcing himself to focus on the mop gliding across the floor. But the pull was relentless. The instrument called to him, not with sound but with memory. When Samuel was a boy, music had been his escape. His grandmother's old upright piano, scarred with age, had been his first teacher. He remembered sitting on the worn bench, his feet barely touching the ground, his small fingers fumbling over the keys. She had placed her hand over his once, guiding him to find not only the notes but the soul behind them. "Music," she whispered, "is not what you play. It's what you give." Years later, he had grown into a young man who could give much. His fingers became nimble, his touch delicate yet powerful. He played in churches, in school halls, sometimes in the quiet of his room when the world outside grew too heavy. He had dreamed of concert stages, of audiences who would rise in awe. But dreams are fragile things, and the world is harsh on those without wealth to shield them. His life had bent beneath the weight of survival. Jobs came, jobs went, and music, once the fire in his blood, became a luxury he could no longer afford. Now, in this ballroom where he was invisible, the fire stirred again. He placed the mop against the wall, his hands trembling slightly. He stood before the piano, staring at its glossy surface, seeing his own reflection staring back, a man in a janitor's uniform, shoulders stooped, eyes lined with years. Yet behind those eyes, another Samuel lived, the boy who once believed his music could matter. He hesitated. What right had he to touch it? The piano belonged to Lawrence Kensington, a man who saw genius as property and art as a weapon. Samuel was not meant to disturb it. If caught, there would be consequences. Perhaps dismissal. Perhaps worse. The thought pressed on him, yet the pull of the keys was stronger. With a breath that trembled in his chest, he lifted the lid. The keys lay before him, pale and waiting, like teeth in the mouth of a beast. His fingers hovered above them, unsure, hesitant. It had been so long. What if he had forgotten? What if his hands betrayed him? He closed his eyes and pressed down gently, letting a single note ring out into the silence. The sound was pure. It soared through the ballroom, rich and haunting, reverberating off marble and velvet. Samuel froze, his chest tight. That single note was enough to awaken every memory, every piece of him that had been buried under years of labor and invisibility. His fingers moved again, this time pressing 2 notes, then 3, then a chord. The sound grew fuller, deeper, until the room seemed to vibrate with it. Samuel's hands began to remember what his mind feared it had lost. The notes flowed, halting at first, then steady, then rising into something that felt like breath itself. His body leaned into the keys, his eyes half closed, his heart racing. The silence of the mansion filled with music, not the polished precision of a master for an audience, but the raw, unshackled voice of a man rediscovering himself. He played not for Lawrence, not for the guests who mocked, but for himself. For the boy he had once been, for his grandmother's guiding hand, for the years stolen from him. The melody that poured out was sorrow and defiance, grief and triumph entwined. It was as though the piano, neglected and reduced to a trophy, had been waiting for him all along. The music carried through the corridors, seeping into the cracks of the great house. It rose to the chandeliers, curled around the empty wine glasses, and swept across the marble floor he had spent the night polishing. It was not just sound, it was freedom. But Samuel was not alone. In the shadow of the doorway, Anna, a young maid, lingered. She had returned to collect a forgotten tray when she heard the first notes. At first, she thought one of the musicians had returned, but as she crept closer, she saw Samuel. Her mouth parted in disbelief. The janitor, whom the guests mocked and ignored, was playing like a master. She clutched the tray against her chest, afraid to make a sound lest she break the spell. She watched as his body swayed with the rhythm, his hands flying across the keys with precision and grace. The music tugged at her heart, filling her eyes with tears she could not explain. It was beauty she had never expected to find in the middle of her weary work. Samuel, lost in the music, did not see her. For him, there was only the piano, only the flood of memory and power. He played until his hands ached, until sweat beaded his brow, until the music rose to a crescendo that filled every corner of the room. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The final chord lingered, trembling in the air, before dissolving into silence. Samuel sat back, his chest heaving, his hands trembling above the keys. He felt both drained and alive, as though he had poured his soul into the instrument and found it return to him tenfold. For a long moment, he simply sat there, eyes closed, savoring the echo of what had been reborn. Anna slipped quietly back into the shadows, her heart pounding. She knew she had witnessed something extraordinary, something no one in Kensington's circle could ever understand. And though she said nothing, her silence carried the weight of a secret that could not be kept forever. Samuel lowered the lid gently, his face calm now, almost serene. He picked up his mop once more, returning to the marble as though nothing had happened. Yet within him, something had changed. He was no longer just the janitor. He was Samuel, the musician. Samuel, the man who could awaken a dead hall with a whisper of the keys. And though no one else knew it yet, the night had marked the beginning of a storm, one that would challenge arrogance, strip away mockery, and prove that genius wears no uniform but the soul. Morning broke over Kensington Hall in a wash of pale gold, the sunlight pouring through high-arched windows and painting long patterns across the marble floor. The grandeur of the mansion, so intimidating by candlelight, softened under daylight, but its authority remained. The night's laughter had faded, yet the weight of its arrogance still clung to the air. Servants moved briskly through the halls, carrying trays, polishing brass, and drawing curtains, each step rehearsed in the rhythm of service. Anna, however, moved differently. Her hands carried the same silver tray she had collected the night before, but her heart was far from routine. It beat fast with the memory of what she had witnessed, Samuel at the piano, his fingers weaving melodies that no orchestra could rival. The music had followed her into her dreams, swelling and fading like the echo of a hymn, and when she awoke, she could not shake the feeling that she had seen something miraculous. She told no one at first. The moment felt sacred, like a secret too fragile to release. Yet silence has its limits, and awe too heavy to keep locked inside. By mid-morning, while polishing glassware in the pantry, she let the word slip to Miriam, another maid. "You won't believe this," Anna whispered, her eyes darting to make sure no overseer lingered nearby. "Last night, after the guests left, Samuel sat at the piano." Miriam raised her brows, unimpressed. And he played," Anna said, her voice trembling. "Not just clumsy notes. He played like a master. Like the piano belonged to him." Miriam's hand froze over the glass she was polishing. "Samuel? The janitor Samuel?" Anna nodded quickly, her eyes alight. "Yes. Him. I swear it." I stood in the doorway and listened. It was, she hesitated, searching for the right word. "It was beautiful. I've never heard anything like it." Miriam chuckled at first, shaking her head. "You must have been tired, hearing ghosts. Samuel's a good man, but a musician. That's like saying the cook is a queen." But Anna's gaze did not falter. Her conviction was too sharp, her memory too vivid. Slowly, Miriam's smile faded, replaced by something more cautious, curiosity tinged with disbelief. "If it's true," she murmured, "then it's a dangerous secret." By noon, the whisper had spread among 3 more of the staff. Each carried it cautiously, like passing a flame that might burn them if spoken too loudly. Some scoffed, dismissing it as imagination. Others raised their brows, intrigued. And a few, those who had long sensed something dignified in Samuel's quiet presence, believed without question. "Did you hear?" whispered a footman while stacking linens. "They say Samuel played the piano last night," another replied. "And not just played," added a third, leaning close. "They say he played like a genius." The rumor threaded through the servants' quarters like smoke through rafters, impossible to contain. Each retelling made it grow, embroidered with new wonder. One said Samuel played a hymn that brought tears to the eyes. Another swore he had filled the hall with a concerto fit for kings. What had begun as Anna's breathless memory soon became a legend whispered in corners, fueling both hope and fear. For the servants, it was more than gossip. It was a spark of rebellion against the hierarchy that ruled their lives. If Samuel, the janitor who scrubbed the floors, carried such genius in his hands, then the walls of Kensington's arrogance were not as impenetrable as they seemed. His music was proof that dignity and brilliance could thrive even in the shadows. But rumors are fickle things. They rarely stay where they begin. By late afternoon, the whispers reached the ears of a butler loyal to Lawrence Kensington himself. Mr. Hargrove, a man of iron composure and meticulous loyalty, overheard two maids in the scullery giggling about Samuel the maestro. He silenced them with a glare, but their words had already lodged in his mind. That evening, while pouring Lawrence his brandy, Hargrove spoke in his usual clipped manner. "There is an unusual matter circulating among the staff, sir." Lawrence, lounging in his leather chair, raised an eyebrow. "What matter?" "It seems," Hargrove said carefully, "that Samuel, the janitor, was observed playing the piano last night." Lawrence blinked, then burst into laughter. "Samuel? That ragged fellow with the mop? Playing my piano?" He shook his head, amused. "The staff grow fanciful when idle. Next they'll tell me the gardener recites Shakespeare." But Hargrove did not laugh. "The account was detailed, sir. A young maid swears he played with skill. Others have repeated the claim." Lawrence's amusement soured into annoyance. "Repeated? You mean the gossip spreads unchecked?" "Yes, sir." Lawrence drained his glass in one swallow, the amber liquid burning down his throat. He set it down with a sharp clink. "Fools! They forget their place. The piano is a symbol, Hargrove. Mine. It belongs to wealth, to refinement, not to the calloused hands of a janitor." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Still, I will not have whispers undermining the order of my house. If Samuel fancies himself a musician, let him prove it before us all. Then we shall see if the rumor survives." Hargrove inclined his head, though unease flickered briefly in his eyes. "Very good, sir." Meanwhile, Samuel remained unaware of the storm he had stirred. He spent the day as he always did, scrubbing floors, polishing brass, hauling buckets. He spoke little, kept to himself, and carried the quiet dignity that made him both invisible and unforgettable. Yet he felt a difference within him, a lightness, a pulse of music that still lingered from the night before. The memory of the piano's voice was like a heartbeat in his chest, steady and alive. That evening, as he mopped the ballroom once more, he noticed the way the staff looked at him. Not with disdain, not with pity, but with something sharper, curiosity. Even respect. Whispers followed him as he passed, subtle but undeniable. A maid smiled faintly when he entered the hall. A footman straightened his back when Samuel's gaze met his. At first, Samuel was puzzled. Then he realized, they knew. Somehow, they knew. The thought both warmed and unsettled him. He had not meant to be seen, had not sought an audience. His music was his alone. And yet, now it was no longer a secret. As night deepened, Samuel once again found himself staring at the piano. He resisted the urge to lift its lid, to let his fingers roam across its keys. He could feel the eyes of the household upon him, waiting. He sensed the weight of expectation pressing close. And somewhere above, in his study lined with books and trophies, Lawrence Kensington III sat plotting, his pride wounded by whispers. Soon, Samuel would no longer play in secret. Soon, the genius hidden in his calloused hands would be forced into the light. For now, the mansion breathed quietly, but beneath the marble and velvet, tension thickened like a storm cloud waiting to break. The rumor had spread. The stage was being set. And Samuel, though unaware of its full consequence, stood at the heart of it all, a janitor whose music had begun to shake the foundations of power. The ballroom had been dressed in splendor once more, its chandeliers blazing at full brilliance, its walls draped in velvet, and its marble polished so fiercely that it shimmered like liquid beneath the glow. Lawrence Kensington III was not a man to let whispers linger unchallenged. He believed in control, of wealth, of people, of perception. And so he had summoned his friends, his allies, and his rivals for an evening unlike the others. This would be no ordinary gathering of champagne and chatter. Tonight, he promised, there would be a performance. The guests arrived in waves, their laughter trailing behind them as footmen carried away cloaks and drivers parked gleaming carriages outside. Curiosity sharpened every expression. Rumors had already reached their ears, the story of a janitor who had dared to touch Lawrence's piano. The tale, scandalous in its absurdity, had spread through parlors and smoking rooms across the city. For the elite, it was irresistible. If true, it was outrageous. If false, it was comedy. Either way, it was entertainment. By the time the last guest had arrived, the hall was swollen with expectation. The piano stood at the center, polished to a mirror sheen, a throne awaiting a king or a fool. Lawrence made his entrance with deliberate grandeur, his black suit gleaming, his cufflinks winking like stars. He lifted his glass, silencing the room with nothing more than his presence. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth as silk yet edged with steel, "you honor me again with your company. Tonight, however, I offer you more than fine food and wine. Tonight, I offer you a spectacle." The crowd leaned in, their whispers quickening. Lawrence let the pause linger, savoring the anticipation. "You have all heard, no doubt," he continued, "the curious rumor that circulates within my household. They say one of my servants, a janitor, no less, has touched these keys and played with the hands of a master." He gestured toward the piano, his smile. "Preposterous, of course. But such nonsense must not go unanswered. And so, I give you this, the chance to witness the truth for yourselves." Gasps and laughter rippled through the crowd. Glasses clinked. Some faces gleamed with amusement, others with hunger for scandal. It was precisely what Lawrence wanted, not music, but humiliation. At a signal, Hargrove, the butler, stepped toward the side of the room where Samuel stood among the servants. Samuel had been ordered to remain in the hall, though he had not been told why. His mop and bucket had been taken from him, leaving him strangely bare, a man without the tools of his invisibility. When Hargrove approached, his voice low but firm, Samuel knew at once that the whispers had reached their peak. "Mr. Kensington requests your presence," Hargrove said, his expression unreadable. Samuel's chest tightened. He glanced toward the piano, its gleaming surface catching the light like an accusation. The crowd's eyes followed him as he stepped forward, their laughter bubbling at the edges of silence. He felt the weight of every stare, the sharp edge of every whisper. To them, he was not a man. He was a story, a curiosity, a spectacle summoned to amuse. Lawrence gestured toward the piano with exaggerated flourish. "There he is. The man of the hour. Samuel, is it not? They say you have a gift. They say you play as though touched by the divine. Come then, let us hear it. Let us see if there is truth in these tales." The crowd erupted with laughter and applause, their voices laced with mockery. Some clapped in rhythm as though calling a jester to stage. Others leaned forward eagerly, their eyes glittering with the cruel pleasure of anticipated failure. Samuel stood still, his hands at his sides, his heart pounding in his chest. He had not sought this. His music had been his refuge, his secret. To share it was to reveal himself, to lay bare what little he had left. Yet now the choice was stripped from him. Lawrence's challenge was not an invitation. It was a command. He walked slowly toward the piano, each step echoing across the marble floor. The hall fell into a hush broken only by the shuffle of silk and the faint clink of glass. To the guests, his uniform was a costume of defeat, threadbare, patched in places, marked by the labor of years. Yet to Samuel, it was a shield. He was not one of them, and he did not need to be. He reached the bench and sat. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling not from fear of the music but from the enormity of what it meant to play. The silence pressed closer, expectant and cruel. He could feel Lawrence's smirk like a blade at his back. From the corner of the room, Anna watched, her hands clenched tightly around the tray she carried. Her heart raced, not with fear for herself but for Samuel. She had seen what he could do. She knew what the guests did not, that this was no farce, no trick. This was truth waiting to be unveiled. Lawrence leaned against a pillar, arms crossed, his voice carrying across the hush. "Play, Samuel. Play for us all. Show us your genius, if genius you truly possess." The words cut through the air, heavy with contempt. Yet within Samuel, something stirred. He remembered his grandmother's voice, her hand guiding his small fingers long ago. Music is not what you play. It's what you give. He lowered his hands. His fingers touched the keys. The first note rang out, pure, resonant, a sound that cut through the crowd's expectation like a blade through silk. It was a whisper at first, a hesitant step into the light. Then another note followed, and another, until the room began to fill with melody. The guests shifted, their mockery faltering. The laughter that had hovered in their throats dissolved into silence. The sound was not clumsy, not the fumbling of a janitor, but the voice of a master. The piano, neglected as a trophy, came alive under Samuel's hands, its strings vibrating with power, its soul awakened. Lawrence's smirk faltered. Samuel played on, his body swaying with the rhythm, his hands moving with precision and grace. He did not play for the crowd, nor for Lawrence. He played for the boy he had been, for the years he had lost, for the truth that could no longer remain buried. The music poured from him like water from a spring, unstoppable, cleansing. The hall, once filled with arrogance and cruelty, now stood transfixed. Guests leaned forward, eyes wide, breath caught. Some clutched their glasses as though afraid to drop them. A woman pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes glistening. The music demanded not mockery, but reverence. Samuel closed his eyes, letting the melody rise. He poured sorrow into the chords, then triumph, then something beyond words, the essence of himself, unshackled at last. The piano did not resist him. It welcomed him, embraced him, gave him voice. And as the final note lingered in the vast silence of the hall, Samuel lifted his hands, the music still echoing in the air like a heartbeat. No one moved. No one spoke. The room, once hungry for his humiliation, now sat frozen in awe. And Lawrence Kensington III, master of wealth and arrogance, stood pale and silent, undone not by power but by music. The hall was suspended in silence after Samuel's first few notes, a silence so taut it seemed even the chandeliers held their breath. The guests, who only moments earlier had been laughing and whispering behind lace fans and polished cufflinks, now leaned forward as if pulled by an invisible current. No one expected this. No one expected him. Samuel's fingers found the keys as though they had been waiting for him all along. The music that rose from the piano was not polite or restrained, but alive, bursting with sorrow and triumph intertwined. His calloused hands, worn from years of labor, moved with the fluidity of rivers. Each chord unfurled with weight, each arpeggio swept upward like wings unfurling against the darkness. The melody began soft, hesitant, like a confession whispered into the night. But with each phrase, it grew bolder, stronger. Notes cascaded like rain on marble, then swelled into thunder rolling through the ballroom. The piano, long reduced to a trophy by Lawrence, was suddenly reborn as an instrument of truth. Its voice carried to every corner of the room, wrapping the audience in sound so rich it seemed impossible that one man could summon it. Samuel played not to impress, nor to entertain. He played because the music demanded release. It was everything he had buried, the years of invisibility, the ache of lost dreams, the indignity of mockery. His soul spilled through the keys, and the crowd, wealthy, polished, arrogant, found themselves stripped of words. A woman in emerald satin lowered her glass without realizing, her lips parted in awe. Beside her, a man who had jeered the loudest earlier now sat frozen, his laughter turned to stone. The quartet of musicians, standing in the corner, exchanged wide-eyed glances. They knew mastery when they heard it, and they recognized at once that Samuel's playing was not skill alone, it was genius. The music shifted, a sudden change in tone, and the audience's breath caught collectively. The melody grew tender, fragile, like a lullaby whispered to a child. For a moment, the ballroom seemed to shrink, intimacy blooming where grandeur once ruled. Guests felt their hearts stir with memories they thought long buried, a mother's voice, a lost love, a simpler time. Tears welled unbidden in the eyes of some who had not cried in years. Then Samuel drove the music higher, building into a storm. His hands flew across the keys, striking chords that roared like an ocean in tempest. The sound filled every inch of space, shaking the marble, rattling the chandeliers. The crowd felt it in their bones, in their very blood. This was no longer performance. This was revelation. Lawrence Kensington III sat stiffly in his chair, his smirk long gone. At first, he had waited for a mistake, a stumble, a wrong note, anything to prove the rumor false. But as the minutes passed, his confidence withered. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass until it threatened to crack. His face flushed, then paled. Around him, his guests leaned closer to Samuel, not to him, and Lawrence felt the shift like a knife twisting in his chest. Samuel did not look at Lawrence. He did not look at the guests. His eyes were closed, his face calm, every fiber of his being poured into the instrument. His back bent with the force of the music, his breath rose and fell with the rhythm. He was elsewhere, in memory, in freedom, in a place beyond the chains of servitude. As the piece reached its height, Samuel struck a chord so powerful it seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the mansion. The sound hung in the air, then fell into a cascade of notes that shimmered like falling stars. The room trembled with it. Men who prided themselves on cynicism sat wide-eyed like schoolboys. Women who lived behind diamonds and silk clutched their hearts as though afraid they might burst. And then, silence. Samuel's fingers lifted, hovering for a heartbeat above the keys before settling in his lap. The final note rang out, a single thread of sound that stretched across the stillness, until it faded into nothing. No one moved. The ballroom, accustomed to noise and grandeur, stood frozen. The silence was not emptiness but fullness, as if the air itself was swollen with what they had just witnessed. For a long moment, there was only the sound of breath, uneven, trembling, real. Then, from the back, a single clap broke the stillness. Another followed. And then the room erupted. Applause thundered through the hall, shaking the walls as fiercely as the music had. Guests rose to their feet, their voices raised in awe and disbelief. Some shouted, "Bravo!" Others simply clapped until their hands stung, unable to find words. The quartet of musicians, humbled, applauded as if they themselves were students before a master. Anna stood near the wall, her tray forgotten at her feet, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. She clapped with the rest, her heart swelling with vindication. She had seen his genius before, now the world had no choice but to see it too. And in the midst of the storm of applause, Samuel sat quietly, his expression calm. He did not smile, did not bow, did not drink in their praise. He had given his music, and that was enough. But for Lawrence, it was not enough. It was ruin. He rose from his chair, his movements stiff, his jaw clenched. His guests, the ones who once laughed at his every word, now looked past him, their admiration fixed entirely on Samuel. The piano that had been his trophy was no longer his. It belonged to Samuel now. The authority Lawrence wielded with arrogance had been shattered by sound. Enough, Lawrence barked, though his voice cracked against the tide of applause. Few even heard him. Those who did ignored him. He stepped forward, forcing his voice louder. Enough. The applause dwindled reluctantly, though eyes remained on Samuel. Lawrence glared at him, searching for something to strip away, something to wound. But Samuel's calm gaze met his, steady and unflinching. For the first time in his life, Lawrence felt small in his own house. He turned sharply, his face flushed with humiliation. The crowd noticed. The whispers began, not of Samuel's rumored failure, but of Lawrence's collapse. His arrogance, once unassailable, now looked pitiful in the wake of music's truth. Samuel rose from the bench, his hands at his sides. He did not bow, did not linger. He walked away from the piano as quietly as he had approached it, his dignity intact, leaving behind the echo of music that no amount of wealth could silence. The guests, stunned and breathless, knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. A janitor had humbled a billionaire, not with words, not with defiance, but with the unanswerable voice of art. And Lawrence Kensington III, once the master of the hall, stood surrounded by his guests yet utterly alone, a man undone by the very piano he had sought to control. For a moment after Samuel left the piano, the ballroom felt unreal, as though time itself had paused to catch its breath. The chandeliers, which had glittered with smug radiance only hours before, now seemed softer, almost subdued. The air carried a strange weight, as though the last note Samuel had played still lingered in the very marrow of the building. Guests stood in clusters, their applause fading into uneasy silence. Their faces, powdered, jeweled, polished, bore expressions that had not been rehearsed in any drawing room. Some still stared at the piano as though it might spring to life again. Others exchanged uncertain glances, their mouths opening but finding no words. For the elite of Lawrence Kensington's world, silence was unusual. Yet now silence was all they had, because to speak too soon would be to admit they did not understand what had just happened. Lawrence stood at the edge of the piano, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. His face was pale beneath the golden light, his smirk shattered, his arrogance stripped bare. He could feel the eyes of his guests on him, not with admiration, but with something closer to pity. A man who had once controlled every whisper, every gesture in his grand hall, now found himself irrelevant in the very spectacle he had orchestrated. To what they had just witnessed. Anna, standing near the wall with her tray abandoned, pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Her eyes were still wet with tears, her chest still tight from the music. She had known Samuel's gift, had glimpsed it in secret, but hearing it fill the ballroom was something else entirely. She looked around and saw faces transformed, guests who had arrived with mockery now humbled, servants who had spent years invisible now standing straighter, emboldened by what they had seen. Miriam, the maid who had doubted Anna the day before, whispered, "You were right." Her voice carried awe, tinged with shame. "I didn't believe you. But I heard it. I felt it." Anna nodded, unable to answer. She felt both joy and fear. Joy that Samuel's truth had finally been revealed. Fear of what it might cost him. The applause, hesitant though it had been when Lawrence tried to end it, now simmered into murmurs. Guests debated in hushed tones, their voices rising with each retelling. How could he play like that? Years of secret study, perhaps. No, no, you cannot fake genius. That was real. Theories bloomed like weeds, each more implausible than the last. Yet none could escape the truth. Samuel had played with a brilliance they could not deny. Lawrence finally forced himself to speak. His voice was low at first, then rose with brittle sharpness. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have been entertained, yes, but let us not forget ourselves. A moment of curiosity is not proof of mastery. Do not let a servant's trick convince you of what is not so." But even as he spoke, he knew his words carried no weight. His guests did not turn to him as they once had. Their eyes drifted elsewhere, lingering on the empty piano bench, or on Samuel's retreating figure as he disappeared quietly into the shadows. Lawrence's grip on their attention, on their reverence, had slipped through his fingers like sand. One of the older men, a patron of the arts, shook his head. "Trick? No, Lawrence. That was not trickery. I've heard Liszt himself, and this was no less powerful." His words carried authority, and others quickly murmured agreement. Lawrence's face flushed crimson. He wanted to retort, to crush the praise, but his tongue felt heavy. His empire was built on wealth, not on music. And tonight, wealth had failed him. The servants, meanwhile, whispered among themselves, their voices carrying a different kind of energy. For them, Samuel's triumph was more than spectacle, it was vindication. They had scrubbed these floors, polished these glasses, endured the sneers of guests and the orders of masters. Yet one of their own had stood before the elite and shown them something money could not buy. He played like the angels, one whispered. "No, better, like he held all our voices inside him," another replied. Hope flickered in their eyes, a hope long buried under the grind of servitude. Samuel's music had reminded them that they were more than invisible hands. They were human. As the night dragged on, the guests tried to resume their revelry. Wine was poured, laughter forced, conversation steered toward safe topics. But the air never returned to what it had been. The piano remained in the center, untouched, untouchable. No one dared approach it now, not even Lawrence. It stood like a monument, a reminder of truth laid bare. Anna slipped away quietly, her heart pounding. She wanted to find Samuel, to tell him what she had seen in the faces of the guests and the staff, to assure him that his music had changed the very air of the hall. Yet she knew he would not want praise. He had given his gift freely, and that was enough for him. Still, she longed to let him know he was no longer alone. Lawrence dismissed the gathering earlier than usual. The humiliation pressed on him like a weight he could not bear. As the last guests departed, their carriages rattling into the night, he stood alone in the empty ballroom, staring at the piano. Its polished surface reflected his face back at him, pale and strained. For the first time, he hated the sight of it. "Damn him," he muttered under his breath. "Damn him." But no amount of anger could erase what had happened. His name, once untouchable, would now be spoken alongside Samuel's, not as victor, but as fool. The thought burned him more than fire. In the servants' quarters, whispers continued long after the mansion quieted. Samuel himself remained silent, as he always had, but his silence carried a new weight. When others looked at him, they no longer saw just a janitor with a mop. They saw the man who had humbled a room of the richest and most powerful with nothing but his hands and a piano. The night had ended, but its echoes would not fade. Samuel had broken the silence of his own life, and in doing so, he had broken the arrogance of Lawrence Kensington. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that was not emptiness, but change. And in that silence, both guests and servants alike began to see the world differently, some with hope, others with fear, but none unchanged. The ballroom had emptied, yet its silence still carried the echo of Samuel's music. The chandeliers glowed faintly now, their brilliance dimmed to a weary shimmer. The air was thick with the remnants of awe, the kind of reverence that clings to a place after something sacred has been revealed. The grand piano sat alone at the center, no longer a trophy of wealth but a monument to truth. Lawrence Kensington III remained, pacing near the marble hearth, his glass of brandy untouched. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a fury he could not control. He had lost more than a game tonight. He had lost his stage, his power, his identity as master of the hall. The staff lingered at the edges of the room, summoned by Hargrove's orders but unwilling to leave. They too had heard the music, had seen the guests reduced to silence. They wanted to know what would happen now. At last, Lawrence turned, his voice sharp with the desperation of a man clawing to reclaim control. "Samuel." From the back of the room, Samuel stepped forward. His uniform was plain, his shoes scuffed, yet in that moment he carried himself with more dignity than anyone present. His eyes were calm, his shoulders straight, as if the music still flowed within him. Lawrence pointed toward the piano with a trembling hand. "You embarrassed me before my guests." "You," his voice faltered. He caught himself, steadied his tone. "You played with skill, yes. I will not deny it. And as I said, as I promised, if anyone could play with brilliance, I would grant them my hand in marriage." Gasps fluttered through the staff like startled birds. Even they had not expected Lawrence to speak the words aloud. The promise had been made in jest, yet now it hung in the air, heavy with consequence. Lawrence straightened, regaining a shred of composure. "So here it is. If you wish, Samuel, I will keep my word. Wealth, power, a place among the elite, it is yours. You have proven yourself worthy." The words were meant to sound magnanimous, but the bitterness beneath them was clear. It was not an offer born of respect, but of pride struggling to survive. Lawrence believed that if Samuel accepted, the humiliation would turn to spectacle once again. The story would shift, a servant who leapt at the chance to marry into wealth. Lawrence's superiority would be restored. But Samuel did not move. He stood in the center of the hall, gazing at the man who had mocked him, and shook his head gently. His voice, when it came, was steady and low, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "I do not need your hand, Mr. Kensington." The silence was absolute. Even the crackle of the hearth seemed to vanish. Lawrence blinked, stunned. "What did you say?" Samuel's gaze did not waver. "I did not play for marriage, or for fortune, or for your approval. I played because the music lives in me, and it demanded to be heard. You cannot give me what I already carry." Murmurs rippled through the staff, their eyes widening. They had seen defiance before, but never like this. Not defiance born of anger, but of dignity so unshakable it needed no defense. Lawrence's face flushed crimson. "You dare refuse me? Do you know what I offer?" "I know," Samuel replied quietly. "And I know what you cannot offer. Respect cannot be bought. Genius cannot be owned. And dignity cannot be given, it must be lived." The word struck the room like thunder. The staff, who had endured Lawrence's arrogance for years, felt their hearts lift. Anna pressed her hands together, her eyes glistening. Miriam whispered, "He's free." Lawrence's fury boiled over. "You will regret this, Samuel. I made you what you are tonight. Without me, you are nothing but a janitor." Samuel's expression softened, almost pitying. "Without you, I am still a man who can play. Without me, you are just a man who cannot listen." Lawrence stumbled back, the weight of those words heavier than any applause. He sank into his chair, gripping its arms as though the marble floor itself had shifted beneath him. For the first time in his life, he looked small in his own house. Samuel turned from him, walking toward the servants gathered near the door. He did not bow, did not apologize, did not hurry. His steps were slow, steady, resonant with the same rhythm as the music he had played. As he passed, the staff straightened, their eyes following him with admiration. Some smiled faintly, others simply watched, their faces lit with a respect that no title could command. At the threshold, Samuel paused. He looked back once, not at Lawrence, but at the piano. Its black and white keys gleamed under the chandelier, silent now but alive with memory. He gave a small nod, as though acknowledging an old friend, then stepped into the shadows of the corridor. The doors closed behind him with a quiet finality. In the silence that followed, the staff began to disperse, whispering among themselves, their voices carrying a new energy, hope, pride, even joy. The legend of Samuel had already begun to form, not as gossip but as truth. They would tell the story for years, how the janitor played like a master, how he humbled the wealthy, how he walked away with nothing but his dignity and left with everything. Anna lingered a moment longer, her eyes still fixed on the door where Samuel had disappeared. She felt a swell of gratitude, not only for what he had played but for what he had shown them all, that greatness does not wear a suit, that music cannot be caged, that dignity belongs even to those the world tries to erase. Lawrence remained slumped in his chair, his glass untouched, his face shadowed by defeat. His guests would tell the story differently now. They would not speak of his wealth or his parties. They would speak of the night he was undone by a man with calloused hands and a gift beyond measure. His promise had turned to folly, his arrogance to ruin. And somewhere in the city beyond the gates of Kensington Hall, Samuel walked alone beneath the stars, the cool night air filling his lungs. He had no wealth, no fortune, no applause ringing in his ears. But he carried something greater, the sound of music that had reclaimed him, the knowledge that he had stood before the world and given himself honestly. He smiled faintly, the lines of weariness on his face softened. The world might never fully see him, but he had seen himself. And that was enough. Thus the legacy began, not of Lawrence, not of wealth, but of Samuel, the janitor who played like a genius and refused to be bought. His story would outlive chandeliers and marble, whispered in kitchens and parlors, sung in streets where the forgotten walked. A new legacy, born not of arrogance, but of truth.